Hi everybody, and thanks for joining us. In a moment, it was 20 years ago, and under the 50-year rule, it's just emerged that half a century ago, this country had its very own X-Files. Top secret until now, the records reveal an astonishing number of UFO sightings in Britain's skies. We'll be talking to the RAF pilots who, back in 1953, both witnessed something so strange that the memory burns very bright in their minds to this very day.
And before we
went through a prolonged bout of mass hysteria in the 50s that sucked in policemen, fighter pilots and airline crew, or there was a burst of inexplicable activity in the skies above and around Britain. Under the 50-year rule, top-secret government papers are now beginning to emerge, which show that decades before Mulder and Scully, we really did have our very own X-Files, and they were the real deal. All kept under wraps at the time, except for the occasional security lapse, like this one, which surfaced on the fledgling BBC television news one November evening back in 1953, and features in an absorbing Time Watch programme on the subject tonight.
A BBC television news report would cause controversy. The X-Files were about to become top secret. Flying officers Terry Johnson and Geoff Smythe had decided to go public with their UFO encounter.
And could it have been any sort of meteorological instrument or balloon?
Well, I don't think so. We've gone into this business, we've argued it out amongst ourselves, and we haven't yet arrived at anything conclusive.
What did you think about this whole flying saucer story, or this event?
Well, up to this time, I was a confirmed skeptic, but now I think I have an open mind.
And there he is, Geoff Smythe, here today, along with his companion in the cockpit that morning, Terry Johnson. Both remain as coolly convinced now that they saw something powerful strange from their two-seater Vampire jet, as they did then. And their story is one of many revealed later tonight in that fascinating documentary.
Over 10,000 UFO sightings have been reported to the British government. These reports and subsequent investigations into flying saucers have been shrouded in mystery and rumour for 50 years. So much so that they are now widely referred to as Britain's X-Files. The birth of Britain's X-Files dates back to 1950. There had been some reports of aerial phenomena by aircrew during the Second World War, but in the United States, a spate of sightings had resulted in one newspaper coining the phrase flying saucer for the very first time. In response, the British government established one of the most bizarre committees in political history, the Flying Saucer Working Party.
Incredible, isn't it? And of course, one of the reports that committee would have been very interested in was the one from Flying Officer Terry Johnson and his navigator and radar operator Geoff Smythe, who laconically reported what they'd seen in their flight log, on which closer examination simply says, saucer day. So what did you see, guys? What was there in the sky that morning?
Well, it's a bright light, which I thought at first was a star or something, then realised it was much bigger. And as it came towards us, I suppose, it then appeared to be a circular disc or ring of light.
See, the documentary's made a kind of mock-up of what you actually saw. Is that how you remember it? That bright light there?
Not quite. It was a bright light, but it was circular, like a polar mint.
Well, actually,
shining bright.
Yes, a donut, really. So it had a sort of a gap in the middle, a gap in the centre?
Well, less or very little light in the middle, because it was so bright. It was, you know, about half the size of the moon, but at least 10 times the brightness of the moon. This was by day, by the way.
So you tapped Geoffrey on the shoulder and said, hey, look at this, because you were burying your head into the radar thing, weren't you? And
I was, yes.
And what did you see?
Well, nothing at first, nothing on the radar, strangely enough. But the radar was searching at horizontally, if you so wish. And this thing, whatever it was above the area that we were sweeping.
So it was out of your radar range at that point?
In terms of height, yes.
And did you see an object that conforms to what your co-pilot just said?
But very briefly, because by the time I saw it, it was disappearing, if you wish.
What do you mean? It was just evaporating or moving away?
No, moving away.
Now, what's interesting about this story is that a few hours later, it wasn't on your radar, it was reported that an object in the same spot in the sky had been seen moving at tremendous speeds, I mean impossible speeds by our technological standards, and had disappeared. And your eyewitness report and that ground radar reporting turned this into headline news. This not, as we can see here from these old headlines, it wasn't just on the TV news, it was all over the papers for days at a time.
Yes.
And in the end, you sort of became laughingstocks, didn't you? People thought it was...
We had our legs pulled, yes.
You had your legs
quite
pulled?
a few times, yeah.
And you were told
Saucer
by the...
Johnson, then.
And you were told by the RAF to shut up?
I don't think we were
No,
told to
we
shut
were
up
not
too
told.
much,
Others
no.
were told to shut up.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually gave the permission to the BBC to come and film us at the first time to take those shots.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the media...
And then thought, oops, we
all
shouldn't have done
newspapers
that.
came on. Then, of course, there was the music hall and the gags, Razor Laugh, or whoever it was at the time. It was Norman Wisdom's peak.
Well, this is
That's
where
a
I must bring
cartoon.
you in, because also joining with us here is Dr. David Clark, who's a social historian from Sheffield University, who's been looking into the recently released X-Files and indeed takes part in that Time Watch documentary. Now, what's happened was that, and after this initial sort of, oh, let's send the BBC down and tell everyone about it, it occurred to people, sort of, if you like, the establishment and high-up authorities in this country that actually they ought to be keeping their trap shut. Why?
Well, they didn't like the publicity, the unwelcome publicity that these kinds of sightings were bringing, and it was...
Why was it unwelcome? I mean, it was interesting and strange, but why...
Well, this was a time when we were fighting the Cold War, and
Yeah.
the government wanted people to think that we had control over the airspace of this country, and they didn't like the idea that things could possibly be intruding into that.
Also, they didn't, I think you say this in the programme tonight, they didn't like basically being in the dark because they didn't know what these things
That's
were.
right.
And they were exposed really by these reports as being completely ignorant.
Exactly. Yeah, and it was only a couple of months after this sighting that a command was issued to all the RAF stations in the country, basically saying that any aircrew that sees anything unusual, not to speak to the press, to report it directly to Air Ministry, and that they were warned that, you know, possibly they could be action under the Official Secrets Act if they did break that rule.
But just very quickly, now we tend to look back and ufologists say, oh, cover up, cover up. It wasn't that. It was just as we've said. It was simply because they were embarrassed that they didn't know.
That's right. And I mean, everything was secret.
You agree,
It's
obviously.
a tradition of secrecy that
was
we've always
admitted
had.
privately
Yeah.
by one MP, George Ward.
What did he say?
The Under-Secretary of State was in one of the books that he said, well, to a leading reporter who was interviewing by whatever method, he said, I know it's not balloons, you know it's not balloons, but I'm not allowed to say anything until a flying saucer lands in Hyde Park and we can charge sixpence.
Yeah.
And
It doesn't exist.
It went right to the top, didn't it? Because you actually have a copy, you in the documentary, have a copy of a note from Winston Churchill, no less, the Prime Minister. Can you see what that... Can you read that, Richard?
What does all this... well, hang on, let's
What's
go
all
close
this
to the screen. What
stuff?
does all this stuff about flying saucers amount to? What can it mean? What is the truth? Let me have a report at your convenience. WSC. Wonderful.
And they had a flying saucer project, didn't they? They wanted to
That's
build
right.
one
Yeah, and
themselves.
when he asked that question, the answer that was given was that there'd been a full intelligence study the year before, which was the Flying Saucer Working Party, which had decided it was all nonsense and there was nothing to it.
Well, if
But
we don't...
they had to revise that.
Yeah.
Well, if we don't know what they were, if we don't know what it was that you saw, it could have been... God knows. I mean, you must have a favourite theory in your mind. Do you think it was an alien spacecraft?
We don't have a theory, but we certainly know it was an unidentified or unexplained flying object.
But do you think it was a natural thing? Do you think it was like ball lightning of some kind, or do you think it was a mechanical device being piloted through the skies?
I think most of us agree that it was a mechanical device
extraterrestrial, by
going
definition.
through the skies.
So what the
Did
devil...
the Russians ever have flying saucers? I mean...
Well, the Air Ministry was worried that the Russians perhaps had perfected some kind of high-tech flying object that could penetrate our air defences.
But that was never proved.
It wasn't the case.
It wasn't the case.
But
so
there were a lot of other possible explanations, such as high-altitude balloons. Ball lightning is another case you mentioned, and you know, there's lots of other possible explanations.
Yes, but the kind of objects that you saw, and I have to say we've also interviewed some a civilian pilot who flew for BA and in 1967 had an almost identical experience actually over the Bay of Biscay, except that he did have it on his radar, and it was also seen by French radar, and it's a matter of record. A silver disc heading towards him at something like 30,000 miles an hour, shot silently beneath the lower wing, about 50 feet below, and vanished over the horizon in a few seconds. And it was tracked on radar. So, all right, they didn't know then what they were. I know we don't know now what they were, but looking at all these records that are now tumbling out of the closet, all these old skeletons coming out now, what might we speculate? Was there perhaps a few years of intense UFO activity above the skies, or was it mass hysteria?
It seems that something unusual was going on, and they could not explain 100% of these sightings. There was always that little residue of about 5% left over, and that is the reason why they had to maintain this little office that monitored these sightings until until today.
And just one final fascinating fact, that Prince Philip was absolutely obsessed with these things. He had an equerry that he used to send.
That's right,
every
yeah.
time. He didn't meet you. Did he meet you,
Not
this equerry?
Prince Philip.
No,
the equerry.
He was sent to Air Ministry to be interviewed by his secretary, who was a squadron leader at the time. No, perhaps the Duke's looking in now. Making up for it.
But also, didn't this guy, the equerry, didn't he also meet with a strange and mysterious gentleman in a London flat called Mr. Janus?
That's right, yes.
And the equerry concluded that this guy was from another planet.
But you think it was MI5, don't you?
I think that's a more straightforward
Trying to find
explanation.
out what Prince Philip knew or thought
Yes.
about say in public, yes.
Because we
Oh,
had to
it's
meet some very
wonderful.
strange people at the time, so...
Yeah. It's such good fun, actually. I mean, it really is.
Well, Dr. Clark's written a great book, actually, about all this, called Out of the Shadows, UFOs, the Establishment and the Official Cover-Up, but now we know the reasons behind that. And it's fascinating to meet two guys looking so well, I must say, after all these years. You flew vampires, did you?
Yeah, vampires.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then onto meteors.
Onto meteors. Mm.
That's right, yeah.
Do you still fly?
No, I gave up about 10 years ago,
Do
15
you,
years ago.
Geoffrey? No?
I went on flying for many years, actually. He was only in the service for 2.5 minutes. I was in it for 34 years.
Cheeky boat.
What was your last plane? What was the last plane you flew?
Britannia.
Right. Well, thank you both very much. Thank you for coming in. And
Thanks,
that
Dave.
Time Watch documentary, which sounds great, is on tonight.
And after the break, a movie
Series of Time Watch starts now on BBC Two with the bizarre, intriguing stories of Britain's UFO sightings and close encounters, and a political cover-up spanning 50 years.
Flying saucers have invaded our planet. Washington, London, Moscow are key targets. The whole world is under attack. Can it survive?
For more than 50 years, reported flying saucer sightings have inspired fierce denunciation and passionate belief. To true believers, the truth is out there. To skeptics, the sightings are easily explained away. But it's now emerged that the government has kept official secret files on each and every reported sighting. The files comprise Britain's best documented UFO incidents. Late morning on a clear autumn day in 1953, Smythe and Johnson's Vampire jet had been cleared for takeoff from the RAF airbase at West Malling in Kent. Their plan was to carry out a routine reconnaissance mission over southeast England.
Well, the whole incident and the whole sighting is as clear in my mind's eye today as it was 50 years ago. We were flying at about 20,000 feet, daylight, late morning, absolutely clear sky, just like today. And on practice interceptions, we're over Kent. I turned onto a northerly heading and saw this bright light, which I thought was a star or a planet. It was like a donut with the centre filled, but bright light around the donut area towards the periphery. I watched it for about 20 seconds. I gave Geoff a nudge.
Well, I was operating the radar, looking actually at nothing at all. I had nothing on the tubes, and his interruption, I was a bit annoyed actually because it would interfere with my concentration. So I came from under the hood, if you like, and confirmed that there was something there. There was something there.
And at that point, it sort of flew across to the right-hand side.
It was something a bit odd. It was something very odd, which has never been proven to us either way, right or wrong.
Smythe and Johnson's sighting is to this day unexplained. It's another case where there was some corroborative evidence on radar. And these cases, well, in fact, there are a whole string of them, you know, which have been going on from the 50s and indeed continue to the current day.